I turned and walked back inside, the taste of whiskey still on my lips, knowing that the storm was far from over. I've always thought of myself as an ordinary guy. Maybe that's the problem, being ordinary, being predictable. I'm the kind of man who works a 9-to-5 job in a company that no one really knows exists. I'm an accountant for a mid-sized tech firm that keeps the lights on but doesn't exactly set the world on fire. My name is Mark, and until recently I thought I had a pretty good life. I've been married to Sarah for 8 years. She's smart, beautiful, with dark hair that cascades over her shoulders like waves of ink. We met in college. She was the enigmatic artist, and I was the nerd who could barely speak to her without stuttering. I was enchanted by her energy, her spontaneity, the way she made the world feel alive around her. And somehow, I managed to win her over, despite all my shortcomings. Sarah worked at an art gallery downtown, managing exhibits and hosting events for pretentious collectors. Her job always seemed more exciting than mine. She had this way of describing her day that made me feel like I was missing out on something. There was always some new artist, some dramatic story, some evening gala that I never attended because, well, spreadsheets and tax codes didn't really fit in with that crowd. We didn't have kids. It wasn't for lack of trying. We talked about it in the early years of our marriage. But as time went on, the conversation just faded into the background. It seemed like the world kept pushing other priorities our way. Or maybe we just grew comfortable in our childless routine. It was easier, simpler, less to worry about. But something shifted a few months ago. Maybe it was too subtle for most people to notice, but I noticed. Sarah started staying out later, her phone buzzing more often, her smile fading when I asked about her day. She started taking more time getting ready for work, dressing a little too nicely for an art gallery that was, by her own admission, not exactly brimming with high society. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was all in my head. After all, we'd been together for so long, and I'd never once doubted her love for me. But the seed was planted, and it began to grow. There was that night, just one of many, that I remember vividly. Sarah had come home late again, the scent of perfume and something musky clinging to her skin. She kissed me on the cheek, but it felt mechanical, like she was doing it out of habit rather than affection. I asked her where she'd been, trying to keep my tone light, but there was an edge I couldn't quite hide. She laughed it off, saying she'd lost track of time talking to a new artist she was bringing into the gallery. "Is it a man or a woman?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. She paused, just for a moment, and then said, "A man, but he's nothing special." The way she said it, too quickly and without eye contact, made my stomach twist. I didn't press further. I just nodded, trying to push the thought away. But that was the night the doubts began to harden into something more concrete. I could feel it, like a splinter under my skin that I couldn't reach. Something was wrong, and deep down, I knew it. The next few weeks were like a slow-motion car crash. I watched everything unfold with a mix of disbelief and dread, feeling powerless to stop it. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. After all, Sarah had been my partner, my confidant, my lover for nearly a decade. How could I even think she was capable of betrayal? But the signs were piling up, and I couldn't ignore them anymore. She became more secretive, her phone always in her hand, the screen turned away from me. She started locking it, something she'd never done before. When I asked her why, she'd laugh it off and say it was because of all the weirdos she had to deal with at work. She began going out more often, always with some new excuse. A late meeting at the gallery, a last-minute dinner with a potential buyer, or an emergency event planning session. I'd offer to join her, but she'd smile and say, "Oh, it's boring. You'd hate it." She didn't even try to hide the way she was pushing me away. One Saturday, she told me she was going to an art convention out of town. She seemed excited, more animated than she'd been in months. I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach as she packed her bag, tossing in clothes I hadn't seen her wear in years. I decided to check the gallery's website for the details of this supposed convention, only to find no mention of it. I waited until she was gone, my mind racing. I tried to tell myself that it didn't mean anything, that maybe the convention was just a small private affair not listed on the site, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, I did something I'd never done before. I went into our shared bathroom and searched through her drawers. I felt guilty, like I was crossing a line, but I couldn't stop myself. I found her makeup bag, her perfume, her jewelry, all the things she always took with her when she traveled. But buried underneath was something else, something that made my heart pound in my chest. A receipt from a hotel in our city, dated 3 weeks ago. The same night she'd told me she was at a gallery event. I felt my hands trembling as I stared at the slip of paper. The name on it wasn't hers. It wasn't mine. It was a man's name I didn't recognize. A lump formed in my throat as I realized I'd been blind, deliberately, stupidly blind. I needed to know more. I needed proof. So I did the thing I'd always promised myself I would never do. I started tracking her movements. I felt like a spy in my own marriage, checking her phone when she was asleep, noting down the numbers she was texting. I followed her once, keeping a safe distance as she drove to a part of town we rarely visited. She parked outside a small, dimly lit bar and went inside. I watched from my car, feeling a strange mixture of fear, anger, and helplessness. After a while, she came back out, laughing, her arm draped around the shoulder of a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a rugged, cocky smile that immediately made me feel sick to my stomach. I watched as they got into his car and drove away, and in that moment, I knew. She was cheating on me. Sarah, my wife, my love, my everything, was cheating on me with him. I didn't know who he was, not yet, but I knew what I had to do. I had to find out who he was, where he lived, what he did. I had to know everything about the man who was tearing my life apart from the inside out. I had to know what he had that I didn't. I knew this was only the beginning of something that would change everything. I just didn't know how much it would cost me. I couldn't sleep that night. My mind was racing with images of Sarah and that man, my stomach churning with a toxic mix of anger and despair. Every smile she'd given me over the past few months, every touch, every laugh, it all felt like a lie now. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what to do next. My thoughts bounced between revenge, confrontation, and a desperate wish that this was all some horrible mistake. But there was no mistake. I had the hotel receipt. I'd seen them together. I knew what was happening. I just needed to confront her, to drag the truth into the light where it couldn't hide anymore. The next day, Sarah came home as if nothing had happened. She breezed in with a smile, kissed me on the cheek, and started talking about her day, the words flowing too smoothly, too easily. I watched her, trying to keep my face neutral, my hands steady. I needed to catch her off guard. "How was the convention?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before continuing with her lie. "Oh, it was fine. Lots of people, you know how these things are." "Really?" I said, raising an eyebrow. "Because I checked the gallery's website and there wasn't any mention of a convention." Her smile faltered. For a moment, I saw a flash of something in her eyes. Panic, maybe, or guilt. But she quickly covered it up. "Oh, it was a last-minute thing, not even worth mentioning, honestly." I nodded, pretending to accept her answer, but inside I was seething. I wanted to scream at her, to make her confess right there and then, but I knew it wouldn't work. She'd deny it, twist the story, make me look like the paranoid fool. Instead, I waited until later that night. I needed proof. Concrete, undeniable proof. I grabbed her phone when she was in the shower, my hands shaking as I navigated to her messages. And there it was, a text thread with a man named Tony. My heart pounded in my chest as I read through the messages, each one more damning than the last. Tony. Can't wait to see you again, babe. Last night was incredible. Sarah, I miss you already. Mark's buying my excuses, lol. Feels like I'm in high school sneaking around like this. I could barely breathe as I read the words. She wasn't just cheating on me, she was laughing about it, mocking me. I felt a rage boiling inside me that I'd never felt before. My hands trembled, and I had to force myself to stay calm. I took screenshots of the messages and sent them to my phone. I needed every piece of evidence, every word that proved her betrayal. When she got out of the shower, I was sitting on the edge of the bed, her phone in my hand. She froze, her eyes wide with shock. She knew immediately what I'd found. There was no point in hiding it anymore. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice barely more than a whisper but loaded with all the anger I'd been holding back. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Finally, she said, "Mark, it's not what you think." "Don't!" I cut her off, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Don't insult me by lying again. Just tell me the truth. Who is he?" She looked away, her eyes filling with tears. "His name is Tony. He's an artist. I met him at the gallery. It just happened, Mark. I didn't mean for it to go this far." "How far has it gone?" I asked, my voice shaking. "How long?" "2 months," she whispered, looking down at her feet. "I never meant to hurt you, I swear. It just happened." My whole body went numb. 2 months. 2 months of lies, of sneaking around, of fucking behind my back while I was at home, believing she was just working late. "Why Sarah?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why him?" She looked up at me, her eyes red. "I don't know, Mark. He made me feel alive. I'm sorry. I didn't want this. I don't know why I did it." I felt the weight of her words crushing me, each one like a knife to my chest. I wanted to scream, to break something, to make her feel the pain she was inflicting on me, but all I could do was stand there, numb, lost, and betrayed. And I realized, as I looked into her eyes, that this was just the beginning. There was more to come, and it wasn't going to end well for Tony, not at all. For the next few days, I went through the motions, pretending everything was fine. It wasn't easy. Every time I looked at Sarah, I felt a mix of fury and heartbreak, and every time I thought about Tony, I felt something darker, something that was quickly taking root inside me. I couldn't let it go. I wouldn't let it go. I'd already decided I wouldn't confront Tony directly. Not yet, anyway. I needed to know more about him. I needed to understand who he was, what he wanted, what he thought he could take from me. I needed to know his weaknesses, his habits, his schedule. I needed to know everything. So I started to follow him. It was surprisingly easy. I'd found his name through Sarah's phone, and from there, I tracked down his social media profiles. Tony liked to show off. His Instagram was filled with pictures of himself. Pictures at art galleries, bars, parties, surrounded by women who looked at him like he was some kind of god. There were even a few pictures of him with Sarah, her face lit up with a smile I hadn't seen in months. It made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to think clearly. I followed him for a week, learning his patterns. He spent most of his time at a bar downtown called The Blind Pig, always surrounded by a group of friends, laughing loudly, playing the role of the alpha male. I'd watch him from a distance, sitting in the corner nursing a beer, trying to blend into the background. He was cocky, arrogant, always the center of attention, and he liked to talk, a lot. One night, I watched as he held court in the middle of the bar, his friends hanging on his every word. He was regaling them with some story about a woman he'd hooked up with, his voice loud, his tone boastful. I clenched my jaw, my hands tightening around the glass in front of me. He had no idea I was there, no idea who I was. Then, as if on cue, Tony's voice rang out, louder than before. "Oh, hello, cuckold!" he shouted, his eyes locking onto mine. A grin spread across his face, wide and malicious. "Your wife is a cool thing, but I dumped her when she said she was pregnant with my child." The room seemed to freeze. His friends burst into laughter, slapping him on the back, their jeers echoing around me. My vision blurred, red creeping in from the edges, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum beat. Pregnant. With his child? The words hit me like a freight train, and for a moment I thought I might pass out. But I didn't. I stood there, keeping my face expressionless, letting them have their laugh. I needed them to think they'd won, needed Tony to feel like the king of his little world, because that's what would make it all the sweeter when I tore it apart. He had no idea what kind of nuclear revenge was coming his way. None of them did. I turned and walked out of the bar, my mind racing. Tony wanted to humiliate me, to make me feel like nothing. But I'd show him. I'd show him exactly who he was dealing with. I spent the next few days setting the plan in motion. I'd found out where he lived, a small loft apartment above a coffee shop not far from the gallery. I knew his schedule, knew when he'd be out and when he'd be alone. I even knew the kind of car he drove, an old, beat-up Jeep that he seemed overly proud of. And now, I knew something else. He thought Sarah was pregnant with his child. I needed to use that. I waited until the time was right, until I knew he'd be home alone, nursing a hangover or preparing for whatever cheap conquest he had lined up next. I watched from across the street, hidden in the shadows, as the lights in his loft flickered on. This was it. Time to put the next phase of my plan into action. I walked up to his door, my heart pounding in my chest, and knocked loudly. I heard movement inside, followed by the sound of the door unlocking. Tony opened the door, a confused look on his face when he saw me. "Mark, right?" he sneered, leaning against the door frame. "What the hell are you doing here? Come to beg for your wife back." I stared at him, forcing a smile. "I'm not here for Sarah," I said calmly. "I'm here for you, and you're going to want to listen to what I have to say." His smirk faltered just a little, and I could see a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Good. He had no idea what was coming. Tony looked me up and down, that arrogant smirk still plastered across his face. He was trying to size me up, trying to figure out if I was a threat or just another fool he could brush aside. I could see the wheels turning in his head, his confidence slowly building back up. He had no idea that he was already caught, that the hook was set. "Come on, man," Tony scoffed, leaning against the doorframe. "What, you gonna try and fight me? You think that'll win her back? She's not even worth it, bro. She's a good lay, but she's more trouble than she's worth." I clenched my jaw, my fists curling at my sides. It took everything I had not to punch him right then and there, to not let the rage bubbling inside me take control. But I knew that wasn't the way. Not yet. Instead, I forced myself to stay calm, to keep my voice steady. "I'm not here to fight you," I replied, my tone even. "I'm here because I think you should know what Sarah's been saying. You might find it interesting." That got his attention. His eyes narrowed slightly. His curiosity piqued. "Oh, yeah?" he said, crossing his arms over his chest. "And what's that, cuckold?" I swallowed hard, keeping my expression neutral. "She's been talking about the pregnancy," I said slowly, watching his reaction. "Saying it might be yours." For a moment, Tony's face went blank. I could see the gears shifting in his head, processing what I'd just said. Then a flicker of doubt flashed in his eyes. "She told you that?" he asked, his voice a little less certain now. "Yeah," I lied, nodding. "She's been saying she's not sure if it's mine or yours. She's planning to go to the doctor. Find out for sure." He snorted, but there was a crack in his bravado. "Bullshit," he muttered, but I could see the doubt creeping in, planting its seed. "Is it?" I pressed, stepping closer, keeping my gaze fixed on his. "Because she's serious, Tony. She thinks you might be the father. And if she is, well, that changes everything, doesn't it?" He laughed, but it was forced, nervous. "Nah, man. She's playing you." I dumped her, remember? She's probably just trying to mess with your head. I shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe she's telling the truth. Maybe you've got more to lose than you thought. I could see the crack widening now, see the fear in his eyes. This was a man who liked to play games, but he'd never planned for the consequences. He'd never thought he'd actually get burned. All right, come in, he said, stepping back and opening the door wider. We can talk about this inside. I'm not having this conversation out here. I walked inside, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. He'd taken the bait. Now it was time to reel him in. Tony's loft was a mess. Empty beer bottles, cigarette butts, clothes strewn about like he'd never bothered to clean up after himself. It smelled like sweat and stale smoke, a far cry from the flashy persona he put on in public. He motioned for me to sit down, but I stayed standing, my eyes never leaving his. So, what's your angle, Mark? He asked, pouring himself a drink. You want money? You think I'm going to pay you off or something? I shook my head. I don't want your money, I replied coldly. I want you to know what it feels like to lose everything, just like you made me lose. He snorted again, but his hand trembled slightly as he raised the glass to his lips. You think I care about her? He asked, trying to sound dismissive. I've moved on, man. She's just a memory. Maybe, I said. But memories have a way of haunting us, don't they? He blinked, clearly unsure where I was going with this. I leaned in closer, lowering my voice. Sarah doesn't know I'm here. She doesn't know that I'm telling you this, and she sure as hell doesn't know what I have planned next. What the hell are you talking about? Tony demanded, his bravado slipping further. I smiled, a cold, calculated smile. You'll see. But first, let's make a deal. I think you'll find it mutually beneficial. Tony stared at me, trying to gauge if I was bluffing or if I was really serious. He had no idea what was coming, but he knew enough to be afraid, and that was all I needed to take the next step. All right, he said slowly, cautiously. I'm listening. Perfect. He had no idea how deep this rabbit hole was about to go. Tony sat across from me, swirling his drink, his eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. His cockiness was still there, but it was fading, giving way to suspicion and a hint of fear. Good. I wanted him nervous. I wanted him off balance, unsure of what was coming next. So what's this deal? He finally asked, his voice strained, as if he were trying to sound nonchalant but failing. I leaned back, crossing my arms, taking my time before answering. I wanted him to sweat. It's simple, really, I began. You're going to help me. You're going to make this right, Tony. You're going to undo the damage you've done. He laughed, a short, sharp bark. And how the hell am I supposed to do that? I can't make your wife unpregnant, man. I ignored his jab, my expression unchanging. You're going to break it off with her, for good this time. No more games, no more texts, no more late-night rendezvous. You're going to disappear from her life completely. He rolled his eyes, but I saw a flicker of doubt in them. That's it? He asked. That's your big plan? I shook my head slowly. No, Tony, that's just the beginning. You're also going to make sure she knows it's over. You're going to break her heart in a way she'll never recover from. Tony scoffed, taking another sip of his drink. Why should I do any of that? I've already moved on. Why do I care? I leaned forward, lowering my voice. Because if you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows about you. Your friends, your family, your little art circle. I'll show them the texts, the pictures. I'll tell them all about the married woman you seduced, how you got her pregnant, and then tried to dump her when it got too real. His face paled slightly. I could see the wheels turning in his mind again, weighing his options, trying to figure out how to spin this. But he didn't know me. Not really. He didn't know how far I was willing to go. I'll ruin you, I continued, my voice calm and steady. I'll make sure you lose everything. Your reputation, your connections, your career. You think you're hot shit now, Tony, but one scandal, one story, and you're done. You'll be a joke, a pariah. For the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. He knew I wasn't bluffing. He could sense the determination in my voice, the cold resolve that comes only when a man has nothing left to lose. All right, he muttered, his bravado deflating. I'll do it. I'll end it with her. But you've got to promise me you won't go public with this. I've got a lot riding on my next exhibit. I can't have this kind of drama blowing up in my face. I nodded slowly, pretending to consider it. Fine, I agreed. But I need to see proof. I want to see her reaction when you tell her. I want to hear her voice when you break her heart. And then, Tony, we'll be even. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. How am I supposed to do that? He asked. I pulled out my phone and slid it across the table. You'll call her, I said, and put it on speaker. Right now. Tony stared at the phone like it was a snake ready to bite him. You're serious? He whispered. Deadly serious, I replied, my voice like ice. Call her, Tony, or I walk out of here right now and start making my calls. He swallowed hard, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the desire to maintain control, to stay on top, but also the realization that he was trapped. Slowly, he picked up the phone, his hand trembling slightly. Fine, he muttered, dialing Sarah's number. I'll do it. He hit the call button, and the ringing filled the room, a tense, suffocating silence hanging between us. I watched his face closely, waiting for the moment of truth. Finally, Sarah answered, her voice bright and cheerful. Hey, Tony, what's up? Tony shot me a quick glance, then took a deep breath. Sarah, we need to talk. I could hear the shift in her tone immediately, the wariness. Okay, what's going on? I can't see you anymore, Tony said, forcing the words out. It's over, Sarah. I don't want to be with you. There was a pause, a heavy silence on the other end. Then her voice came back, shaky, hurt. What? Tony, where is this coming from? Is it because of Mark? He looked at me again, his face twisted with discomfort. No, it's not about him. I don't feel anything for you anymore. I never really did. You were just a distraction. Fun for a while, but not worth the trouble. I felt a surge of satisfaction as I heard her gasp, heard the pain in her voice. You're lying, she cried. You said you loved me. You said... I say a lot of things, Sarah. Tony cut her off coldly. But I never meant them. Not really. You're just another woman to me. Nothing special. I'm done with you. I could hear her sobbing now, her breath hitching over the line. Tony's face was pale, his jaw clenched, but he didn't hang up. He let her cry, let the silence stretch on, and then finally he ended the call. He dropped the phone on the table, his hand still shaking. There, he said, his voice low and angry. Are you happy now? I nodded slowly, feeling a grim satisfaction settle over me. That's a start, I replied, but it's far from over. Tony stared at me, his eyes wide, a mixture of fear and hatred brewing within. Them. He thought he had lost everything already, but he hadn't seen anything yet, not by a long shot. Tony's expression hardened into something feral, like a cornered animal ready to lash out. I could feel the tension radiating off him, a mix of anger, confusion, and fear. He had done what I asked, but I knew he was far from broken, and I needed him to be broken. I didn't say another word. I just gave him a final, steady look and turned to leave. As I walked out of his apartment, I could feel his eyes burning holes into my back. I knew he wouldn't let it end like this. I knew he'd try to fight back. And that's exactly what I was counting on. The next morning, I started phase 2 of my plan. I called in a favor from a friend, someone I knew from my college days who worked in cybersecurity. With a little persuasion and a bit of cash under the table, I got him to do some digging into Tony's life. I needed more dirt on him, something that would give me an even tighter grip. It didn't take long for my friend to find it. Turns out Tony had a few skeletons in his closet. Debts, for one. He was deep in the hole with a few unsavory types around town, and he'd been using his artistic endeavors to launder money. There were some pictures, too, of Tony at underground poker games, mingling with people you'd never expect to find in a gallery. All it took was a few well-placed messages to some of these contacts, letting them know Tony had a bit of cash stashed away and that he might not be as trustworthy as he seemed. Things started happening quickly after that. A few days later, I was back at the Blind Pig. I hadn't been there since Tony's little performance, but I knew he would be. The place was his throne, the center of his kingdom. I waited in a dark corner, nursing a beer, eyes on the door. It wasn't long before he showed up, swaggering in like he owned the place. But tonight, there was something different in his step. Something less sure, more cautious. I watched as he made his way to his usual spot, his friends gathering around him. But this time, I noticed a few unfamiliar faces in the crowd. Men who didn't fit, who seemed out of place in the art scene. They were watching Tony closely, too closely, with looks that spoke of business rather than friendship. I knew they were the people I had reached out to, people who were interested in Tony for reasons that had nothing to do with art. Tony was beginning to sweat now. I could see it in his eyes, the way he kept glancing around the room, as if sensing something was off. I waited, keeping my distance, enjoying the show. His phone buzzed, and he glanced down at it, his face tightening with worry. I could only imagine what kind of messages he was getting. Suddenly, one of the men, a thick-necked guy with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward, blocking Tony's path to the bar. I watched as they exchanged words, Tony's face growing pale. The man leaned in, whispering something into Tony's ear that made his eyes widen in fear. The man then patted Tony on the shoulder, too hard to be friendly, and walked away. Tony's hands were shaking now, his face drawn and anxious. I could see him trying to compose himself, to act like nothing was wrong, but it was clear the walls were closing in. I'd gotten to him, and it was only going to get worse. I waited until later that night, knowing he'd be drinking to numb whatever storm I'd kicked up. When I saw him leave, alone, I followed at a distance, keeping my headlights off, my car far enough back that he wouldn't notice. He drove erratically, stopping at red lights, hesitating at turns. He kept looking in his rearview mirror, his paranoia growing. I kept my distance until he finally pulled into a parking lot near his apartment, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. I parked on the street, out of sight, and watched as he stumbled out of his car, looking over his shoulder. "Hey, Tony!" I called out from the darkness. He jumped, spinning around, his eyes wide. "What the—" I stepped out of the shadows, walking slowly toward him. "I told you this isn't over," I said, my voice low and calm. "And it won't be until you understand what it feels like to lose everything." Tony's face twisted in anger. "What the hell do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice trembling. "I did what you asked. I broke it off with her. Isn't that enough?" I shook my head. "No, Tony, not nearly enough. You still think this is a game, don't you? You still think you're going to come out on top. But you're not. I'm going to make sure of that." His eyes flicked around, searching for help, but there was no one around. He was alone, vulnerable, just like I wanted him. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper now. I smiled, a slow, cold smile. "You'll find out soon enough," I said. "But know this. I'm just getting started." With that, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, in the dim light, shaking, afraid, and completely alone. Tony's world was beginning to collapse, piece by piece. I could see it in his eyes, in the way he carried himself. His once confident swagger had turned into a skittish, paranoid shuffle. He was looking over his shoulder constantly, jumping at shadows. It was everything I wanted, and yet it wasn't enough. Not yet. I started planting seeds, little whispers here and there. I called his friends, pretending to be a concerned colleague. I told them I'd heard rumors about his debts, his shady dealings. I suggested that maybe Tony wasn't who they thought he was. I watched as they began to distance themselves, one by one, their smiles growing more forced, their greetings more strained. I made sure to tip off a few of his contacts about his mounting problems, too, letting them know that Tony might be a risk they couldn't afford. It didn't take much. A few calls, a few messages, and suddenly, Tony found himself isolated. Then I went a step further. I knew Tony had a temper. I'd seen flashes of it before, beneath his smug exterior. I decided to use that against him. I called him one night, disguising my number, disguising my voice. "Hey, Tony," I said in a low, gravelly tone. "You're not going to like what you hear, but I thought you should know. Mark's been talking to the wrong people about you. Might want to watch your back." I hung up before he could reply, imagining the panic that would set in. I knew he'd go looking for me, that he'd be furious, desperate to confront me. That was exactly what I wanted. 2 nights later, I was back at the Blind Pig. I took a seat at the bar, keeping my head low, my eyes sharp. I knew he'd come. And he did, storming through the door, his face a mask of anger and confusion. He spotted me immediately, his eyes narrowing, and he shoved his way through the crowd. "Mark!" he shouted, drawing the attention of everyone around. "What the hell are you doing?" I looked up, pretending to be surprised. "Tony, what's this about?" He grabbed me by the collar, pulling me close. "You know damn well what this is about," he spat. "You've been spreading lies about me, haven't you? Telling people I'm some kind of crook?" I kept my voice calm, my expression steady. "I haven't told a single lie, Tony. Everything I've said is true. And you know it." He was breathing heavily now, his fists clenched, his face flushed with rage. "You think you're smart, don't you? You think you can just waltz in here and ruin my life?" I stared him down, my gaze cold. "I don't think, Tony. I know." I could see the moment he snapped. His eyes blazed with fury, and before I could react, his fist came flying at my face. I felt the impact, the sharp pain as his knuckles connected with my cheek, sending me stumbling backward. The bar erupted into chaos, people shouting, chairs clattering as they backed away. I tasted blood in my mouth, but I didn't care. I'd gotten exactly what I wanted. I stumbled to my feet, wiping my mouth, a smile creeping onto my lips. "That's it, Tony," I taunted. "Show everyone who you really are." He came at me again, but this time, a couple of guys from the bar grabbed him, holding him back. I saw the fear in his eyes now, the realization that he'd taken the bait, that he'd played right into my hands. "Get him out of here!" the bartender shouted, pointing at Tony. 2 bouncers moved in, hauling him toward the door as he struggled against them, shouting, "You son of a bitch! This isn't over, Mark! This isn't over!" I stood there, rubbing my jaw, feeling the pain, but also the rush of satisfaction. I'd made him lose control in front of everyone. His friends looked at him differently now, wary, unsure. His reputation was crumbling, and I was only just beginning. Later that night, I made another call, this time to the police. I used a burner phone, keeping my voice calm and measured. "There's a guy named Tony Jenkins," I said, giving them his address. "I've heard he's been dealing drugs out of his place. Might want to check it out." I knew it wasn't true, but it didn't matter. Tony had pissed off enough people in his life that the cops would at least take a look. And if they found anything at all, it would be enough to drag him down even further. 2 days later, I heard from a friend in the department that the tip-off had been taken seriously. They'd raided his apartment, found nothing illegal, but enough suspicious items to bring him in for questioning. Tony spent a night in jail, and by the time he got out, his nerves were frayed to the breaking point. I saw him again that night. He looked like hell. Dark circles under his eyes, hair disheveled, his clothes rumpled. He was on edge, flinching at every sound, every shadow. I watched from a distance as he made his way home, looking over his shoulder every few steps. He was cracking, and I was there to make sure he shattered. I sent him one more message, anonymous and brief. You thought it was over. It's not. Watch your back. Tony was spiraling now, lost in a labyrinth of his own making. He didn't know where the next attack was coming from or who to trust. He was exactly where I wanted him, alone, afraid, and on the verge of collapse. But I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Tony was unraveling fast. Every day I could see the effects of my efforts. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembled when he thought no one was looking, and his once easy smile had vanished, replaced by a permanent scowl. He was avoiding his usual haunts, showing up less and less at the Blind Pig, keeping to himself. The Tony who once strutted around like a king was now a shadow, haunted and hunted. I knew it was time for the final push. I decided to pay Tony another visit, this time at his apartment. I knew he'd be there, holed up, paranoid, unsure of who was coming for him next. I waited until dusk, when the city began to quiet down and the shadows lengthened, creeping over the streets like a dark blanket. I walked up to his door and knocked, loud enough to make sure he'd hear. I could feel my heart beating hard against my ribs, but I kept my face calm. I heard movement inside, the sound of something being knocked over, followed by hurried footsteps. He was nervous, afraid. Good. Finally, the door creaked open just a crack, and I saw his eyes peeking out, wide and bloodshot. "Mark," he croaked, his voice hoarse and strained. "What the hell are you doing here?" I smiled slightly. "We need to talk," I said, "and this time, you're going to listen." He hesitated, glancing around as if expecting someone else to jump out from the shadows. Then, slowly, he opened the door and let me in. The place was even more of a wreck than before. Empty bottles, half-eaten food, and the unmistakable stench of fear. I stepped inside and turned to face him. He was jittery, his hands twitching, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. "You're ruining my life, man," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Why won't you just stop?" I took a step closer, my voice low and steady. "Because you haven't suffered enough," I said. "You took everything from me, my peace, my trust, my marriage, and now I'm going to make sure you lose everything too." Tony's face contorted with anger, but I saw the tears welling in his eyes. "I get it, okay?" he snapped. "I messed up, I get it. But what do you want from me? An apology? Is that it?" I shook my head slowly. "No, Tony," I replied. "I want you to feel what it's like to lose everything, to have your life ripped apart piece by piece until there's nothing left." He was shaking now, fear mixing with rage. "I can't take this anymore," he muttered, his voice breaking. "You don't know what it's like, man. You don't know—" I cut him off. "Oh, I know," I said softly. "I know exactly what it's like, and I've decided I'm not done yet. Not until you're completely broken." He collapsed onto his couch, burying his face in his hands, sobbing quietly. I watched, feeling a cold satisfaction settling in my chest. This was the man who had taken Sarah from me, who had flaunted his conquest, who had taunted me in front of his friends, and now he was reduced to a weeping wreck. But I wasn't finished yet. I pulled out an envelope from my jacket and tossed it onto the coffee table in front of him. "Open it," I said. Tony looked up, his face streaked with tears, and hesitated. He slowly reached for the envelope, his hands shaking, and opened it. Inside were printed screenshots, his texts to Sarah, his emails to his shady contacts, a photo of him taken at one of those underground poker games, all the evidence I'd gathered, neatly laid out. His eyes widened as he looked through the pages. "What? "What is this?" he whispered. "It's everything I've collected on you," I said. "And I've sent copies to a few key people. Your gallery, your investors, a couple of your friends. By now they've all seen it. They know who you really are." Tony's face went pale. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "No, you didn't." "I did," I interrupted. "And now you've got nothing left. No friends, no career, no reputation. Just like you left me." He stared at me, his face contorted in anguish, his breath coming in short gasps. "You bastard," he whispered, his voice broken. "You've ruined me." I leaned in closer, my voice a whisper. "No, Tony, you ruined yourself. I just made sure everyone knew." He slumped back against the couch, a defeated look in his eyes, his spirit broken. "So, what now?" he asked, barely more than a breath. "What do you want me to do?" I took a deep breath, letting the silence hang between us for a moment. "I want you to leave," I finally said. "Disappear. Get out of this city, this state, hell, this country for all I care, and never come back. If I see you again, if I hear about you again, I'll make sure the rest of your life is even worse than this." He nodded slowly, defeated, broken. "Fine," he muttered, his voice hollow. "I'll go." I stood up, turning to leave, but paused at the door. "One last thing, Tony," I said, not looking back. "You think I'm done with you now, but I'll be watching, always. Remember that." With that, I walked out, leaving him alone in his wreck of an apartment, a broken man with nothing left to lose. I knew he'd leave, that he'd disappear. He had no choice, and for the first time since I'd discovered his betrayal, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had won. The next few days were a blur of adrenaline and emptiness. I had done it. Tony was gone. Word spread quickly. He'd packed up and left town overnight. His friends whispered about debts, threats, and secrets exposed. The gallery where he once swaggered around like a god had cut ties with him completely, issuing a curt statement distancing themselves from his recent activities. I thought I'd feel triumph, satisfaction, a sense of justice. Instead, I felt a strange numbness, a hollow ache that didn't seem to fade. I had set out to destroy the man who had ruined my life, and I had succeeded. But now, in the quiet aftermath, I realized that nothing had changed for me. Sarah was still here, in our home, going through the motions. She had been devastated by Tony's sudden disappearance and his brutal words during their last conversation. She was a wreck, barely eating, hardly sleeping, her eyes puffy and red from crying. I watched her, feeling a mix of pity and contempt. This was the woman I had loved, the woman who had betrayed me. Now, she was broken too, a casualty of the war she'd unknowingly set in motion. I tried to go back to normal life. I went to work, sat at my desk, stared at spreadsheets and numbers that no longer held any meaning. My colleagues, who'd heard about my bruised face from the bar fight, asked questions I brushed off with vague answers. I could tell they were curious, maybe even concerned, but I didn't care. I was already too deep in my own thoughts, lost in the silence of my own making. One evening, as I was sitting alone at the kitchen table, nursing a glass of whiskey, Sarah walked in. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were sunken, her face pale. She sat down across from me, folding her hands on the table. "Mark," she began, her voice thin, almost a whisper. "I don't know what to say. I know I've hurt you. I know I made a terrible mistake." I didn't say anything, just stared into my glass, watching the amber liquid swirl. "I don't know why I did it," she continued, tears streaming down her face. "I was stupid, selfish. I never wanted to lose you." I looked up at her, feeling the weight of all the months of lies and betrayal pressing down on me. "You already lost me, Sarah," I said quietly. "You lost me the moment you chose him over us." She sobbed, her hands shaking. "Please, Mark, please give me another chance. I'll do anything. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. I sighed, the weariness settling deep in my bones. I don't know if there is a way to make it right. Not after everything. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing against mine. I love you, she whispered. I've always loved you. Please don't give up on us. I felt a flicker of something. Pity, maybe, or the ghost of the love we once shared. But I couldn't tell if it was real or just a remnant of what used to be. I pulled my hand back, shaking my head. I don't know if I can forgive you, Sarah, I said softly. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. She broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably. I watched her cry, feeling both detached and strangely moved. This was the woman who had been my life, my partner, my everything. And now she was just a stranger who had made choices that shattered everything we had built. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. I need some air, I muttered, grabbing my jacket and heading for the door. I walked outside, feeling the cool night air against my face. I stood on the porch, staring up at the stars, wondering if I'd ever feel whole again. I'd gotten my revenge, and in doing so, I'd torn everything apart. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, a new message lighting up the screen. It was from a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated, then opened it. Unknown. You think you've won, but this isn't over. I'm still watching you. Always. A chill ran down my spine. I looked around, peering into the darkness beyond the porch. The street was empty, but I could feel eyes on me, watching from somewhere in the shadows. Tony. He hadn't gone as far as I thought. Maybe he had never left at all. I realized then that the game wasn't over. It had only changed shape. I had unleashed something dark, and it was coming back to haunt me. My revenge had only stirred deeper forces, ones I couldn't control. I put my phone back in my pocket, feeling the weight of my actions settle back onto my shoulders.